We ended last section discussing the experiences intersex people have interacting with the medical establishment. In this section, we will briefly cover transgender history in the US and then compare transgender children's experiences interacting with the medical establishment to see how similar or different their experiences are compared to intersex people. Before we get into that, let's talk about the language we will use when talking about transgender people. The language related to gender is ever evolving, and sometimes it may seem hard to keep up and know what the right terms to use are. These differences in terms may seem small, but they signal a lot in terms of the ways in which we talk about and think about transgender people and value their experiences. In this class, for example, we will use the terms transgender person or transgender people rather than transgenders or a transgender. Along similar lines, although people may individually identify themselves as transsexual, and you may see that term used in older readings or articles, we will use the term transgender or being transgender rather than transgenderism or transgendered. If you have questions or would like more information on terms, you can ask me or follow the link below to the GLAD Media Guide. In terms of how many adults are transgender in the US, we don't have exact population counts. A 2011 study estimated that there were around 700,000 transgender adults in the US. However, a larger study in 2016 estimated that 1.4 million adults identify as transgender in the United States. Currently, demographers are not sure if this increase is due to better reporting or more people feeling comfortable about coming out as trans. In terms of state-level data, the state with the highest number of trans people is California, and the state with the lowest is North Dakota, while Washington, D.C. and Hawaii have the highest population percentage of transgender adults. In terms of reporting, currently the US Census does not ask people to identify their gender identity. The US Census Bureau gathered feedback from 29 transgender respondents in focus groups conducted between September 2016 and June 2017 in order to assess the feasibility of asking about gender identity in the current population survey. And they wanted to see how transgender respondents felt about the collection of gender information from a federal government agency. In terms of the pros of collecting gender identity information, respondents said that it would go further to understand the experiences of trans people and where they live. In addition, knowing the true population percentage allows agencies to demonstrate need and perhaps increase their funding for the work they are doing to help issues that transgender people face. The focus group also voiced concerns about census interviewers and potential sharing of data in non-official ways, so outing people's identities as transgender, and whether it would be feasible in general to come up with meaningful categories given the diversity of terms used by trans people within the transgender community and the debates about the use of different terminologies as well. In this next section, I will provide a brief overview of trans history over the past 60 years or so in the United States, and in particular, the cultural schemas that have been used in these various time periods. In the reading, Halberstam makes the argument that it seems like older and younger generation of trans folks occupy different realities. So we are going to investigate the reasons why he says that. But as we do, keep in mind the sociological perspective here and what makes the experience of being trans in the 60s different from the 80s or the 90s, the 2000s, and even the 2010s when interacting with different institutions like the psychiatric and medical establishment and how the internet has affected the trans experience. So keep these in mind as we talk about trans experiences. The 1960s in the US is defined by some as the gender clinic era. At the time, transgender people were labeled as having gender dysphoria, which was defined as the severe mental pathology resulting from being anatomically one sex but having the gender identity of another. To get access to these clinics, trans people had to present in a certain way according to cultural expectations about masculinity and femininity at the time. For example, clinics would not take you if you were assigned female at birth and had been pregnant or had a child because to them that demonstrated that you were not sufficiently committed to your male gender identity. By the end of the 1970s, there were approximately 20 gender clinics in major cities across the US, and over 100,000 surgeries had been performed. The overarching approach to understanding trans people who came of age in the gender clinic era was arguably this essentialist understanding of gender. So, again, referring back to this clear male female binary, but in their case, they thought they were just on the wrong side of it. A quote from a trans person who came of age at this time captures this perspective, saying, "My gender did not change. My gender was the one constant. I changed my physical sex to match my internal gender." At the end of the gender clinic era, we saw a shift in understandings of gender that were broadened, in that gender could change across the life course with the impact of different life events. This coincided with internal debates about the gatekeeping of doctors to access surgery and funding cuts to gender clinic and other health programs during the 1980s. The cultural schema of this time fell more to the open identity model, in which people felt more able to create bodies that they were personally comfortable with. This may mean opting for surgery, not opting for surgery at all, taking hormones but not having surgery, whatever an individual felt comfortable with. During this time, we also see the importance of creating chosen families in places like ballroom culture, especially as the HIV/AIDS crisis took hold. Moving into the late 90s and early 2000s, we see a growing acceptance of a diversity of gender identities within the trans community and society at large, which was facilitated largely by the internet. As we move into the present day, we have entered a new era of trans history with new medical technology that is accessible to adolescents. The cultural schema has moved to one where cisgender adults are now advocating for the inclusion and recognition of their transgender kids in places like schools, hospitals, and other institutions. As Halberstam notes, this is a significant generational difference in that now kids can transition in adolescence rather than adulthood. This is not only a huge change in the experience of being trans, but also in the relationship between generations of trans people. Halberstam asks, how did children become so central to the narrative of transgender discourse today? And further, whose experiences are centered when we talk about trans children? So as you watch Growing Up Trans, keep Halberstam's question in mind, but also keep in mind some of the aspects of the sociological perspective and how their experience with the medical establishment relates to the experience of older generations of trans adults and also the experiences of intersex people with the medical establishment that we covered in the last section.